They told us not to take the detour. Everyone who's driven Route 66 knows about it. An unmarked gravel road that cuts through the desert. The locals call it Devil's Bypass. It's supposed to save you 30 miles, but every time it comes up, people get that look in their eyes, the one that says, "Don't ask why." But we were cocky, 5 friends in a beat-up van, chasing thrills on our cross-country trip. There was me, Dylan, the practical one. Sarah, my girlfriend, always eager for a good photo op. Chris, our self-proclaimed daredevil. Amy, the skeptic who laughed in the face of danger. And Nate, the quiet guy with a knack for fixing anything that broke. We were a crew, tight-knit and invincible. So, when we saw the dirt road branching off Route 66, the Devil's Bypass, Chris grinned, and that was it. No debate. He was already turning the wheel before anyone could stop him. "Come on, Dylan," he teased. "We'll be back on the main road in an hour. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. The sun was dipping below the horizon as we hit the bypass. The desert bathed in fiery orange. It was stunning at first, sand dunes and jagged rocks stretching endlessly in every direction. But then the road started to narrow, the gravel crunching ominously under the tires. The van's headlights seemed swallowed up by the encroaching darkness, revealing nothing but eerie shadows that danced in the periphery. That's when we noticed the first sign. A rusted metal slab sticking out of the dirt. "Turn back. Not safe." Chris laughed. "Classic. Someone's trying too hard to be scary." Amy smirked. "Let me guess. Next there's gonna be a sign that says, 'Beware of ghosts.'" But Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Dylan, this doesn't feel right." The second sign came about a mile later, this one larger and covered in bullet holes. "Stay out. You have been warned." "Okay, that's a little much," Nate muttered from the back, his voice uneasy. I glanced at Chris. "Maybe we should turn around." "No way," he said, his knuckles white on the wheel. "We're committed now. Besides, it's just a scare tactic. We'll be fine." We weren't fine. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No wind, no crickets, not even the hum of the engine seemed normal. It was muffled, like the air itself was swallowing sound. The dirt road turned rough, jostling us so hard Nate cursed when his drink spilled. Sarah had her phone out, but the GPS wasn't loading anymore. Just a spinning circle and a no-service banner at the top of the screen. And then we saw it. Out of nowhere, the road opened into a clearing. In the middle of the dusty expanse was a gas station, or what was left of one. The sign above it was crooked and faded, the letters barely legible. "Last Chance Gas." The pumps were relics, their hoses dangling like severed limbs. A single fluorescent light flickered above the door, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement. "All right, this is creepy," Amy admitted, peering out the window. "Just an old gas station," Chris said, but his voice had lost its bravado. "We're low on fuel, so let's check it out." "We're not stopping," I said, glaring at him. "No way." But the van sputtered before I could finish the sentence. The engine coughed twice, then died completely, leaving us in heavy, oppressive silence. "No freaking way," Sarah whispered. Chris hit the dashboard. "Relax. It's probably just out of gas." "Nate, you're up." Nate grabbed his flashlight and a gas can from the back. "I'll check the tanks. Stay here." We watched as he stepped out into the clearing. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating clouds of dust kicked up by his boots. He made it to the nearest pump and tried the nozzle. Nothing. Then he bent down, fiddling with something near the base. "What's he doing?" Sarah asked, gripping my arm. "Checking for gas," I muttered, but I didn't believe it myself. Nate's flashlight flickered, and then went out. A moment later, so did the gas station's single light. "Nate!" Chris shouted, but Nate didn't answer. The clearing was pitch black now, the only illumination coming from the van's interior light. Then we heard it, a faint thump from somewhere in the shadows, followed by another. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over gravel. "Nate, this isn't funny," Amy called out, her voice shaking. Another thump, closer this time. Sarah grabbed my hand. "Dylan, Do something. I reached for the door handle, but Chris stopped me. No, don't go out there. That's Nate. We can't just leave him. I swung the door open, stepping into the freezing desert air. My breath fogged in front of me as I crept toward the gas station, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might drown out the footsteps. Nate, I called out. Nothing. The van's headlights flicked on suddenly, cutting through the darkness. In the beam, I saw Nate, or at least I think it was Nate. He was standing motionless near the edge of the clearing, facing away from us. His body was rigid, arms hanging unnaturally by his sides. His head cocked slightly to one side, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. Nate! I shouted, moving closer, and then he turned. When Nate turned, I froze. His face was pale and slack, eyes wide but unfocused, like a puppet being held up by invisible strings. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just the faint clicking of his teeth, like he was trying to speak but didn't remember how. Nate! My voice cracked as I stepped closer. Behind me, the van door slammed. Chris shouted, "Dylan, get back here now." But I couldn't move. Something wasn't right. Nate's movements were too stiff, too unnatural. His head tilted sharply to the other side, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something glint behind his eyes. A quick silver shimmer that wasn't human. Then he raised one arm and pointed toward the gas station. "Come see," he whispered, his voice low and broken, like it had been dragged across gravel. I took a step back. "Nate, what the hell are you?" "Come see." His voice grew louder, more insistent. He took a jerky step forward, then another, each movement like a marionette being yanked by a clumsy hand. Behind him, shadows began to writhe along the edges of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind stirring up the dust, but the shapes were wrong. Too tall, too human. They gathered in clusters, their forms shifting and stretching unnaturally, their movements disjointed and predatory. "Dylan, run!" Sarah screamed from the van. I turned and bolted, sprinting back toward the headlights. Gravel crunched beneath my feet, and I could hear the faint rustling of those things moving closer. My lungs burned as I dove into the open van door. Chris slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. "What the hell was that?" Amy shouted, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "I don't know," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "Something's wrong with Nate. He's not him." Through the windshield, we saw Nate standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing, staring at the van. The shadows around him swirled like living smoke, closing in until they were right behind him. Then they stopped, and Nate smiled. It wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too sharp, and stretched across his face like it didn't belong there. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I heard a voice in my head, faint and alien. "Come see." Chris didn't wait. He turned the key in the ignition, and the van roared to life. Gravel sprayed as he floored it, the tires skidding before catching traction. We tore out of the clearing, the headlights illuminating more of those shifting shapes as they scattered into the desert. As we sped down the dirt road, Sarah turned to look out the back window. Her face went white. "What?" I demanded, twisting to see. "They're following us." I turned just in time to see the shadows streaking through the desert behind us, their movements impossibly fast. They twisted and stretched, lurching closer with each second. "Faster, Chris," I shouted. "I'm trying," he yelled back, the van bouncing violently over the uneven road. The figures were nearly on us when the dirt road suddenly met pavement. The van jolted onto Route 66, the tires screeching as Chris swerved back onto the highway. The headlights caught a sign just as we passed it. "Devil's Bypass. Do not enter." For a moment, the shadows hesitated at the edge of the gravel road, swirling like a living storm. Then, one by one, they melted into the darkness. We drove for miles in silence, none of us daring to speak. When we finally stopped at a gas station hours later, the attendant gave us a strange look. "Long night?" he asked. Chris just nodded, too shaken to reply. The attendant's gaze lingered on the van. You kids didn't happen to take Devil's Bypass, did you? Amy swallowed hard. Why? The man sighed, shaking his head. Folks who take that road don't usually make it back. We didn't sleep that night. After leaving the gas station, we parked at a roadside motel, but nobody even touched the beds. We sat in the van, too scared to leave its cramped safety. The air inside was thick with tension, each of us replaying the events in our heads, but too afraid to speak about them. Sarah broke the silence first. Nate's gone. Her voice was hollow, barely above a whisper. Whatever that was, it wasn't him. Chris shook his head. Gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. We can't just leave him out there. Amy snapped. Leave him? Chris, you saw what we all saw. That thing wasn't Nate anymore. And you want to go back? Are you insane? Chris didn't answer. He just stared out the windshield, his jaw tight. Whatever happened back there? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We're not going back. We don't even know what we were dealing with. Sarah glanced at the window, her eyes scanning the empty highway beyond the glass. What if it followed us? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. None of us had the courage to answer it. The next morning, we decided to stick to main roads for the rest of the trip. No shortcuts, no detours, no risks. But the unease followed us like a shadow. The highway stretched endlessly in front of us. The same desert scenery on all sides. Hours passed, and the monotony made us all jumpy. Around midday, we reached a rest stop. It was one of those desolate, sun-bleached places in the middle of nowhere. 2 vending machines, a picnic table, and a single bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 80s. I need a break, Amy muttered, grabbing a water bottle as she climbed out of the van. Sarah followed her, stretching her legs. Chris and I stayed behind, our nerves too raw to relax. I watched the two of them wander toward the picnic table, their laughter forced and brittle, like they were trying too hard to act normal. Then I saw it, a shape on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the desert heat. But as it drew closer, my stomach dropped. It was a figure, walking down the empty highway toward the rest stop. Its gait was slow and deliberate, and though the sun obscured the details, I could feel its gaze locked on us. Chris, I said, my voice barely audible. He followed my stare, his face draining of color. Get them back in the van. Now. I jumped out, shouting for Sarah and Amy. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind but obeyed, jogging back to the van as I climbed into the driver's seat. The figure was closer now, close enough to see the glint of something metallic in its hand. Who is that? Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. Chris leaned over, his voice tight. Doesn't matter. Drive. I threw the van into gear and sped out of the rest stop, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure stop at the edge of the lot, watching us leave, and then it smiled. By the time we reached civilization, we were wrecked, physically and emotionally. We returned the van to the rental company and went our separate ways, each of us vowing to forget what happened on Route 66. But forgetting wasn't an option. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo, the gas station, the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, and Nate staring straight at the camera, his too wide smile carved into his pale face. We all saw the message. Sarah, Chris, Amy, our phones lit up at the same time. No one knows how it got our numbers. No one replied, and no one has spoken about it since. But every so often, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. And sometimes, if I look out the window long enough, I swear I see a figure standing in the shadows, waiting. Chris started drinking more after we got back. At first, it was just an extra beer or two during football games. Then it became something else entirely, something darker. When I saw him a few weeks later, he looked hollowed out, like a man who hadn't slept in days. It's Nate, he muttered, staring into his drink. I see him, in my dreams, in the corner of my room. He just stands there, smiling. You're just traumatized, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We all are. That place, it messed us up. But it's over now. Chris shook his head, his knuckles white against the glass. No, Dylan. It's not over. He's not gone. He's waiting. 2 days later, Chris disappeared. His roommate said he packed a bag and drove off in the middle of the night. No one's heard from him since. Amy and I were the only ones left. We tried to keep each other grounded, but it was clear the cracks were starting to show. Sometimes I think we should have gone back, she said one night over the phone. Maybe if we had, I don't know, done something, it would have stopped. Stopped what? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. A week later, I woke up to a voicemail from Amy. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. Dylan, I need to tell you something. I've been seeing them, the shadows, the ones from the desert. They're here, in my house. The message cut off abruptly. I called her back, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove to her place, pounding on the door until my fists ached. The police eventually arrived, but the house was empty. The only thing they found was her phone, lying on the living room floor, with one new photo on the screen. A blurry figure, standing in her backyard. It wasn't Nate. It was taller, its features impossible to make out. But it was smiling. It's been 6 months now. I haven't heard from Sarah, Chris, or Amy. I've moved twice, changed my number, and scrubbed my social media. But no matter what I do, I feel it, the weight of something watching me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. Other times, it's the faint sound of gravel crunching, like someone walking up the driveway. I haven't looked yet, but I know one of these nights, I'll see him, Nate, or what's left of him, and he'll be smiling. I couldn't take it anymore. The nights were endless, filled with phantom footsteps, fleeting shadows, and whispers I couldn't quite understand. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the fear was real, too real. One night, as I sat in the dark with a bat in my lap and every light in the house blazing, I made a decision. I had to go back to Route 66, back to the Devil's Bypass. If I didn't face whatever this was, it would consume me. I spent the next day preparing. Flashlights, batteries, a camera, and a weapon, a hunting knife I found at a pawn shop. I even left a note on my kitchen table in case I didn't come back. By sunset, I was on the road. The drive felt like stepping into a waking nightmare. The closer I got to the bypass, the heavier the air became, like the desert itself didn't want me there. When I reached the turnoff, my hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. The faded "Do Not Enter" sign was still there, leaning at an odd angle. I parked just past the entrance and stepped out into the cold desert night. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots. With every step, I felt the pull of that cursed clearing, the place where everything had started. When I reached it, the gas station was exactly as we'd left it, decrepit, crumbling, and bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. But something was different this time. The air shimmered, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. And then I saw him. Nate was standing in the middle of the clearing, just as before. His face was blank, his posture rigid. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, the shadows swirled, forming shapes, vague, humanoid figures that seemed to flicker between solid and smoke. "Dylan," Nate said, his voice cold and alien. "You came back." I gripped the knife tighter. "What do you want?" He tilted his head, his smile widening. "It's not about what I want. It's about what they want." The shadows surged forward, encircling me. Their presence was overwhelming, their whispers invading my mind, showing me images. Sarah, Chris, Amy. They were all here, lost in the swirling darkness, their faces blank and their eyes empty. I felt myself being pulled, my body freezing as the shadows closed in. Their whispers grew louder, promising release, relief, and an end to the fear. But something deep inside me refused to give in. "No!" I screamed, lunging toward Nate with the knife. The blade connected, and for a moment, the world seemed to shatter. The shadows recoiled, screeching like 1,000 voices at once. Nate's expression twisted, his smile vanishing as he crumpled to the ground. The clearing erupted in chaos. The shadows swirled violently, their forms breaking apart. I stumbled back, barely making it to my car as the entire area seemed to collapse in on itself, the gas station folding into the ground like it had never been there. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked on Route 66. The bypass was gone. Just endless desert where the dirt road had once been. I don't know what I stopped that night. I don't know if I stopped anything at all. But the shadows haven't followed me since, and the nightmares have started to fade. Still, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That someday, somewhere, I'll hear that voice again. And when I do, I hope I'm ready. I thought it was over. For months, my life returned to something resembling normal. No footsteps outside the window, no whispers in the dark. Even the nightmares faded, leaving only fragments I couldn't quite piece together. But the scars of that night stayed with me, hidden just beneath the surface. Every flicker of a streetlight, every shadow that moved too quickly in the corner of my eye, it all reminded me of the bypass. And Nate, I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of the trauma. Dr. Evans was patient, kind, and practical. She never dismissed my fears, even when I told her the truth, or at least, the version of it I could bear to tell. "You experienced something profoundly disturbing," she said one session, her pen tapping softly against her notepad. "Your mind is trying to protect you by creating distance. That's why it feels like it happened to someone else." But it didn't feel distant. Not really. A few weeks later, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no markings, just a plain brown box left on my doorstep. I almost didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong. But curiosity won out. Inside was a single item, a VHS tape. My blood ran cold. I didn't own a VCR, but the local thrift shop had one collecting dust in the corner. I bought it, took it home, and hooked it up to my TV with trembling hands. The tape started with static, crackling and hissing like a storm in my living room. Then the image came into focus, the gas station. It was exactly as I remembered, down to the flickering fluorescent light. But this time there was no Nate, no shadows, just a man standing in the middle of the clearing, his back to the camera. The figure was familiar, too familiar. He was wearing the same clothes I had on that night. It was me. The camera zoomed in as I turned around, and my own face stared back at me. But it wasn't right. My eyes were empty, my mouth twisted into that too wide smile I'd seen on Nate. The screen went black, and a single sentence appeared in white text: "You never left." I tore the tape out of the player and smashed it into pieces, my hands shaking. But the message was clear. The bypass, the gas station, the shadows, they hadn't let me go. Maybe they never would. I don't know if I'm still trapped there. If everything I've experienced since that night has been a lie, a trick. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something behind my eyes. Something that doesn't belong. And it's smiling. After the tape, I couldn't trust anything. Every day felt like I was slipping further from reality. Like the shadows from the bypass had infected my mind. My reflection in the mirror lingered too long. My shadow seemed to move when I was still, and my own thoughts were beginning to betray me. I stopped going to work, ignored calls from friends, and barely ate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words from the tape: "You never left." The breaking point came one night when I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. My heart pounded as I reached for the knife I kept on the bedside table. Slowly, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just the empty driveway, bathed in moonlight. I let out a shaky breath, but before I could step away, the porch light flickered, and there it was. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was watching me, its head tilted, its posture eerily familiar. My stomach turned as it stepped closer, the porch light casting its face into view. It was me. My double stared back at me, its lips curling into that horrifying smile. I stumbled away from the window, my breathing ragged. When I turned back, the figure was gone, but the words were written on the glass, traced in some dark, oily substance. You never left. I knew then that I couldn't run from it anymore. If the bypass had followed me here, it would never stop. I had to confront it, once and for all. The next day, I packed a bag and drove west, back toward Route 66. The road felt endless, the desert stretching out like a prison I couldn't escape. When I reached the bypass, the dirt road was there again, like it had never disappeared. The sign was gone, but the feeling was the same. Suffocating, oppressive, and cold. I parked at the entrance, stepping out into the heavy silence. "Come on," I shouted, my voice echoing into the void. "I'm here. Show yourself." Nothing happened at first. Then the shadows began to stir, rising from the ground like smoke. They surrounded me, their whispers deafening, their forms shifting and stretching. And then I saw it. The gas station, appearing out of the darkness as if summoned. The light above the door flickered weakly, casting a sickly glow over the clearing. Nate stood in the doorway, his smile too wide, his eyes empty. "You came back," he said, his voice hollow. Behind him, the shadows writhed, growing larger and more solid. They reached out toward me, their tendrils brushing against my skin. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. Nate tilted his head, his grin widening. "You were never supposed to leave. You're part of this now." The shadows surged forward, and I felt myself being pulled into them, my body freezing as darkness consumed me. I woke up on Route 66, the sun rising over the desert. My car was parked on the shoulder, its engine still running. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my reflection didn't move. It smiled. After that night on Route 66, I tried to live a normal life, but normal had become an illusion. Days passed like shadows flitting across the walls, fleeting, indistinct, and meaningless. Every reflection, every photograph, every surface that could show my image became a source of dread, because I wasn't alone anymore. At first, the changes were subtle. My reflection lagged by a fraction of a second, or its expression shifted when I wasn't looking directly at it. Then came the whispers. "Stay. Belong. Never leave." They started in the quiet moments, barely audible beneath the hum of the fridge or the rustling of the wind. But soon, they grew louder, filling the spaces around me until they were impossible to ignore. And always I saw him. One night, as I sat in the darkened living room, the TV flickered to life. Static filled the screen, and then an image appeared. The gas station, glowing faintly under the flickering light. I tried to turn it off, but the remote wouldn't respond. The screen shifted, showing the clearing, the shadows swirling like a storm. And then there he was, my double, standing in the center of the frame, his smile too wide, his eyes empty. "Dylan," he whispered, his voice crackling through the static. "It's time to come home." The TV went dark, plunging the room into silence. My phone buzzed on the table, and I almost didn't pick it up. But something compelled me to look. A single text message flashed on the screen. "Outside." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned to the window. He was there, standing on the other side of the glass, his face inches from mine. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, speeding down the highway. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was far away from him. But the road stretched endlessly, the desert blurring into a monotonous expanse. The headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, I saw it. The gas station, its sickly glow appearing on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded to a stop right in front of it. "You can't run," a voice whispered, though no one was there. The door to the gas station creaked open, revealing the swirling darkness within. I didn't want to go in, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. Inside, the shadows closed around me, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. The air was thick and cold, pressing against my chest until I could barely breathe. And then he appeared, my double, stepping out of the darkness. "You can't fight it," he said, his voice calm and final. You're part of this now. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like a vice. I felt myself being pulled, my body dissolving into the darkness. But just as I was about to give in, I remembered something. A spark of defiance, buried deep inside. "No," I whispered, then screamed, "No!" The shadows recoiled, their grip loosening. My double's expression twisted, his smile faltering for the first time. "You can't escape," he snarled, but I didn't listen. I ran. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my body covered in cuts and bruises. The doctor said I was found unconscious on the side of Route 66, miles from any town. They said I was lucky to be alive. But as I stared at my reflection in the window that night, I knew the truth. I hadn't escaped. Not really, because in the glass, my reflection was smiling. I thought I had escaped. I told myself the hospital room, the kind faces of the nurses, and the steady beep of the monitors meant it was over. The bypass, the shadows, my reflection. They were all part of a nightmare I could leave behind. But the truth was carved into my bones. When I was discharged, I returned to my apartment, hoping familiarity would anchor me. Didn't. Every corner of my home felt foreign, every reflection a threat. The whispers returned first, faint and distant, like echoes from another room. Then came the dreams, dark, suffocating things where the gas station loomed, its sickly glow burning into my mind. I started avoiding mirrors entirely, covering them with sheets. But the reflections found me in other ways. In puddles, in windows, even in the glint of a knife on my kitchen counter. No matter where I looked, I saw him, my double, waiting. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done," I shouted into the darkness, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The room fell silent. Then, from the mirror I'd covered in my bedroom, a voice replied, "Come home." The sheet over the mirror began to ripple, as though caught in a breeze, and I froze. Slowly, it slid off, revealing my reflection, or what should have been my reflection. Instead, he stood there, smiling, his eyes locked onto mine, and his lips moved in perfect sync with the voice that filled the room. "It's time, Dylan. You were never meant to leave." The glass shimmered, rippling like water. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, impossibly stretching beyond the surface. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The room folded in on itself, the walls dissolving into shadow. I felt the air grow cold as the gas station materialized around me, its glow casting long, flickering shadows. This time, there was no escape. The shadows pressed close, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. My double stood at the center of it all, his smile impossibly wide. "You can't fight it," he said. "You belong to us now." I dropped to my knees, the weight of the darkness crushing me. For the first time, I stopped fighting. I stopped running, and then I laughed. My double's smile faltered. The shadows recoiled, their whispers stuttering into silence. "You think you've won?" I said, standing despite the crushing pressure. "You think you own me? You're wrong." I reached into my pocket, pulling out the hunting knife I had kept since that night. The blade gleamed in the sickly light. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." With a roar, I drove the knife into the ground. The gas station shook, the shadows shrieking as cracks spiderwebbed through the floor. The light above flickered violently, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning. My double's face twisted, his smile finally breaking. "No!" he screamed, his voice warping. "You can't." The cracks widened, swallowing him and the shadows in a churning vortex of light and darkness. The gas station began to collapse, folding in on itself as the world around me dissolved into chaos. When I woke, I was lying in the middle of Route 66, the sun warm on my face. The bypass was gone, no dirt road, no sign, no gas station. Just empty desert stretching out in every direction. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked at my reflection in the side mirror of a passing car. For the first time in months, it was just me. No whispers, no shadows, no smile. I don't know what really happened that night, Maybe I defeated it, or maybe I just bought myself some time. But one thing is certain. I'm free now. For how long? I don't know. But every night before I sleep, I can't help but glance at the mirror, half expecting to see him there, waiting. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.